the talk by this evening's keynote speaker, John Hofmeister. And to introduce John, we have Helen Theoret, or Hélène Théoret, depending on how you like to pronounce it. I think both are acceptable. Hélène is a chemical engineer from the Université de Sherbrooke, au Quebec. She's had a long and distinguished career in the oil and gas industry, including abroad in London. And on returning to Canada in 2011, Helen moved to Calgary and is now General Manager for Supply and Distribution in Canada. She is the chair of Shell's Downstream Crisis Management Team and a member of the Country Coordination Team. And she is also a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Petroleum Products Institute. And I'd like to ask Hélène to come and introduce our guest speaker.
So good evening, everyone. I'm glad I didn't get to interrupt the meal and someone else did it on my behalf, so thank you.
I'm the disciplinarian.
Yes, very well done. So it's my big pleasure today to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. John Hofmeister. And John retired from Shell, and I'm a Shell employee, so it's kind of a bit of a link there, which I think is why I have the honor of introducing him to you tonight. It's quite a distinguished bio, so let me walk you through it. John retired from the Shell Oil Company in 2008, and he founded and today heads the not-for-profit nationwide membership association called Citizens for Affordable Energy. It's a Washington-registered company. It's a public education and policy firm, and it promotes sound U.S. energy security solutions for the nation. This includes a range of affordable energy supplies, efficiency improvements, essential infrastructure, sustainable environmental policy, and public education as well on energy issues. John was named the president of the Houston-based Shell Oil Company in March of 2005, and he headed the country leadership team, which included the leaders of all the different Shell businesses that were operating in the United States. He became president after having served as a director of human resources in The Hague in Netherlands for the Shell Group. As the president of Shell, John launched an extensive outreach program. It was unprecedented in the energy industry, and it was meant to discuss all the critical industry challenges around global energy supply. The program included an 18-month, 50-city engagement program across the country, during which John led 250 other Shell leaders to meet more than 15,000 business, community, and civic leaders, policymakers, and academics to discuss what just had to be done in order to ensure affordable, available energy for the future. Now, John has continued in this vein. He continues to run outreach programs, both in Canada and the U.S., and the proceeds for that are all contributed to his agency, and it furthers the work that the agency does. As a business leader, John has participated in the inner workings of multiple industries for over 35 years. He's held executive leadership positions in General Electric, Nortel, and also Allied Signals, now Honeywell International. He serves as a chairman of the National Urban League, and he's a member of the U.S. Energy Security Council. He's a member of the Department of Energy's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technical Advisory Committee. He serves as a non-executive director of Hunting PLC, Lufkin Industries, Camac Energy, and the Sodexo North America Business Advisory Board. He's an advisor to Liberty Power of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which is the nation's largest minority-owned power company. He also serves on the board of the National Energy Security Council in Washington, on the Foreign Policy Association, New York, Strategy Partners, LLC, the Gas Technology Institute, and the Center for Houston's Future. So John is a fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources, and he's also a past chairman and serves as a director of the Greater Houston Partnership. John is active in education, and he serves on the Energy Advisory Board of the University of Houston. He's also director of the Texas Education Reform Committee. He's earned a bachelor's and master's degree in political science from Kansas State University, and in May 2010, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of letters from the University of Houston. John Hofmeister is also the author of Why We Hate Oil Companies. I said that right, so Why We Hate Oil Companies. Straight Talk from an Energy Insider, which was published by Macmillan in 2010. So please join me in warmly welcoming John to speak to us tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Helen, thank you for that introduction. And Minister Oliver, Brian, Peter, ladies and gentlemen, imagine yourself on a Monday morning last October listening in to a conversation between President Obama and Prime Minister Harper. You can just hear the words coming across the telephone lines. Hello, Mr. Prime Minister, this is Barack. I've had a rough weekend here. Can you imagine 8,000 people joined arms together around the White House, in addition to others who were holding segments of a pipeline over their heads? And I looked down at them from my helicopter as I was flying out for my golf match on Sunday morning. And it was a sight to behold. So, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm really sorry to tell you that based upon the circumstances here in the U.S., we're not going to be able to approve a permit to build the Keystone Pipeline. And I can imagine the Prime Minister saying, well, I was worried about this, and you have confirmed my worst fear. You realize that I'll be booking flights to Beijing shortly after this phone call. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, you got to do what you got to do. That's always been my motto. You got to do what you got to do. Talk to you later. You can just imagine that conversation, maybe a little more formal, maybe a little more less formal, who knows? I wasn't there, but I could imagine it. Because that week came the public announcement that based upon considerations that have yet to be made, it's unlikely the Keystone Pipeline would be approved before 2013. Later, we found out that Mr. McKibben, an environmentalist who organized that locking of the arms demonstration around the White House, along with other environmental interests, had been very clear to the re-election campaign committee that the environmental movement as a source of campaign funding in the face of a decision to move forward on the Keystone Pipeline would basically opt out of campaign contributions for the duration of the re-election campaign. So goes the politics of U.S. energy. Predicated upon flavor of the day, political circumstances, the United States of America is essentially robbing consumers around the world, including here in Canada, of disposable income to an extent that many people just don't realize. When the largest consuming economy in the world, which the U.S. is, consuming nearly 20 million barrels a day of oil, struggles to produce about 6 million barrels a day of its own domestic resources, in a country that has more oil than Saudi Arabia, in a country where the president, in order to excuse the price of oil, says publicly and repeatedly, well, the U.S. only has 2% of the world's oil reserves. We can't possibly drill our way out of this problem. Defying logic, defying pragmatism, and defying the facts, because the 2% number is simply a comparison of proven reserve to the rest of the world, not probable and not possible reserve, completely negating the reality of the trillion-barrel deposit of oil shale in the Piceance Basin of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, completely ignoring all of the offshore opportunities off the coast of Alaska, California, Middle Atlantic states, Eastern Gulf of Mexico, and completely ignoring oil prospects on federal land, which are a long way from proven reserve category, making Americans believe that we're running out, that we don't have enough. I would submit to you that the United States of America has more energy, just like Canada, than it will ever need. And it's a matter of choice, what America could do. The reason I start with America for your conference, ladies and gentlemen, is you have a real problem to your south. It's affecting your economy. It's affecting the disposable income, because the price of a barrel of oil is driven by a country that imports anywhere from 50 in a good year to 65% of its oil from around the world. Particularly its willingness to acquire oil from a cartel called OPEC, which not only takes the money for that oil to use against the United States of America, but in reality adds to the insecurity of Americans, as well as adding to the economic hollowing out of the United States of America. You'll hear, I believe, from Wenren Jiang tomorrow, professor at the University of Alberta, who has very close ties to the ministries in China to better understand what economic development means in China. And I don't want to steal his thunder. But let me just suggest that based on his research, where economic development is the priority of an autocratic government that can deliver on its promises, the likelihood of oil demand in China rising is as sure as we are sitting here tonight. In 2005, China consumed about 5 million barrels a day. This year, it will be approximately 10. By 2015, the likelihood is it'll be 15 million barrels a day. India is going to go from 4 to 7 million barrels a day by 2015. And in December of 2010, when I predicted $5 gasoline in the United States by the summer of 2012, people laughed. Gasoline was about $2.60, $2.40 in some communities. And who's this character coming along saying the price of gasoline is going to double by 2012? It was simply doing the math from Wenren Jiang's projections. And where are we today? This week we'll hit $4 gasoline as a national average. In parts of the US, it is already $5 a gallon in the high tax states of California, New York, and in Illinois. The problem is that serious, ladies and gentlemen, that many oil company executives who see the demand rising in Asia for crude oil, who understand that the Chinese last year bought 20 million new vehicles, many of them first-time owners, who are putting gasoline in a new tank of a new vehicle for the very first time, a purchase which they've never previously made. And as oil executives see this growing demand, and they see the politics at work in the United States, they throw up their hands and say, we're going to have gas lines. Probably by 2014, 2015. I keep moving it up. In my book, I said 2018. But things have gotten that much worse, that much more quickly in terms of the animosity and the opposition. You may have seen film recently in the last few weeks or a couple of months about the president having a so-called all-in, all-the-above energy policy. That's a campaign tactic. Because when you look at the real numbers, where the federal government has influence, such as permits on federal lands, they're down 40% from 3 years ago. When you look at the Gulf of Mexico, which is not yet recovered from the moratorium of 2010, which in fact is declining in output because of the moratorium and because of the delayed permit granting in the Gulf of Mexico, they're down about 300,000 barrels a day equivalent. When the president talks about more oil being produced any time than in the last 8 years, yes, thanks to programs from the previous administration which really pushed oil shale production and hydraulic fracking, both for gas and oil production, which this administration very likely will choose to regulate nationally come January 2013 upon re-election. The Environmental Protection Agency of the U.S. government has been conducting a 2-year study on fracking technology and threats to clean air, clean water, and clean land. And very likely will find fault with state regulatory authorities where it currently is governed. And so the private lands and the state permits, which have been used to modestly increase production, and we're talking modestly, we're less than 500,000 barrels up from 8 years ago. So when we talk about more, it's all relative, right? In a country that uses nearly 20 million barrels, 500,000 helps. But when you still need 11 to 12 million barrels a day of imports, it's not helping all that much. And there's so much more to do. But we're here to talk about Canada. But I think it's important to warn you that what happens to the south of you is critically important to what happens here. And the issue with the country to the south of you is that the politics of energy undermines the governance of energy. And without the governance of energy, you really have nothing. And I'll get into that in just a little bit more detail. As China's economy grows, as India's economy grows, as the rest of the developing world grows, the current world output of 88 million barrels has to get to 98 to 100 million barrels a day in the next 3 to 4 years. And that won't happen. Which is why China has launched a loan program. Loans to state-owned oil companies, real cash, to develop new oil reserves, which will become part of China's payback. Oil that will be produced by state-owned oil companies in countries like Nigeria, Kazakhstan, Ghana, Brazil, Venezuela, and others, over $120 billion committed to loans to make sure that that oil never goes on the global market, so that China gets it first. That oil will be committed to China to pay back the loans in the time frame in which the West has an economy that's recovering, until perhaps the high price of oil slows or derails that economic recovery. That's the risk. It's very important for what the minister had to say earlier to happen, because Canada can only set itself up for growth and prosperity in the face of that because of your natural resource base and your willingness, which I have admired from the early to mid-90s in the last century, to look at your natural resources as a strategic resource for strategic purposes. And yes, watching that evolution occur as companies began to test the various technologies and go through the various trials and tribulations of making the oil sands come to life, and then going through the pain and the difficulty of learning from the difficulties that are faced, how to modify or change the technology to move, for example, to SAGD from open pit mining, and all that went with that, and to take the flack from the environmental community and the others, particularly US groups that would be opposed to it, to face into some of the airlines who agreed a few years ago to issue a letter asking the United States government to prohibit oil sands oil from getting into the aviation fuel of their airlines, a very ill-informed choice by the airline. This was before they hit the high prices of aviation fuel in the 2006, 7, and 8 period when that letter was produced. It was about 2005. And so you have the opportunity to guide yourselves, perhaps learning some of the lessons from down south. We have three problems that stand in the way of our energy future in the United States. The first I call partisan perversity. You can watch it play out in the electoral process in the United States. You can watch it play out in the activities of the US Congress, where one house is led by one party and the other house by another party. You can watch it in the reversal of one administration's reversal of policies from the prior administration. So the new administration took over in 2009, and it was an anything but Bush program, negating Bush programs that had been worked on for 6 to 8 years. The Bush administration took over from the Clinton administration and had an anything but Clinton program. The politics of perversity are more about power, holding or obtaining power, than it is about the needs of the nation. Best demonstrated by the Keystone Pipeline decision. It's more about power, my power to be president, my chance to have a second term, than it is about the pocketbooks of Americans who the president is elected to serve. The second problem is just as serious. It's called political time trumps energy time. So whatever needs to be made in the 2-year election cycle, built into the Constitution of the United States and the way the country is run, the election cycle beats all other priorities based upon what needs to be done in the perception of those running for office, with an electorate that is poorly informed about the stakes or the consequences, either through disinterest or through lack of communication or lack of reading, which is why I'm so heavily involved in outreach to make sure people have the information they need. The third problem is something that can only happen in America. With the kind of comments I'm making, you must understand how popular I am in Washington, D.C. these days. And it goes back to the questions that I ask when I'm there. I deliberately put my foundation in D.C. so that I could be there frequently in order to ask questions. As an executive, I learned that the primary authority that an executive has is to ask questions of his staff or his suppliers or his stakeholders or whatever. So I still ask questions. It's an executive trait you can't get rid of very easily. So the question I ask in the executive branch offices when I visit is, can anyone please explain to me why in the United States of America it takes 13 cabinet officers plus the White House to govern energy? 13 cabinet-level officers. Was it any wonder that the State Department was going to decide the Keystone Pipeline? What in the world does the State Department have to do with the oil supply of the U.S.? Well, quite a lot, as we learned, as we came to find out. But 13, the Secretary Chu, the Secretary of Energy, 80% of his responsibilities have to do with watching over the nuclear fleet in the U.S. and the nuclear weapons of the United States. 80% of his responsibility is just over the nuclear safeguards and the nuclear fleet of plants. 20% deals with the rest of energy. But then the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Transportation, the Environmental Protection Agency, the CFTC, and on, agency after agency, 13 of them. If you want relief, you go to Congress, right? Well, Congress has 26 committees between both houses of Congress, 26 committees. I ask, well, why not 24? Well, you can't do that. That would take away from the seniority that people have earned. Well, what if we just had one in the House and one in the Senate? Oh, you can't do that. That's radical reformation, and nobody tells Congress what they can do, least of all you. And then if you're looking for relief in the judiciary, well, there are 800 federal judges in the United States, 800 plus, appointed for life, any one of which can decide a national policy from his or her bench based upon a case brought to their bench, whether they know anything about energy or not. So with 800 judges, with 535 elected representatives, with one president with 3,000 presidential appointees governing energy, is it any wonder that the United States of America has so much governance of energy that it essentially has no governance of energy? And then you complicate the situation further with 50 governors, 50 state legislatures, 50 state Supreme Courts. On top of that, tens of thousands of municipalities and counties which have their own permitting authorities for their own territory. The governance of energy in the United States, ladies and gentlemen, is chaos. And it's not about to be fixed anytime soon when it is governed by the politics of energy. That's an issue to watch out for. You can learn from what we do or don't do. But I have a suggestion to make. You are on the cusp of setting directions in this country for the next 50 years, which will impact the citizens here over the next 50 years. And I would offer a particular form of advice. And when it comes to fuels in particular, there is a terrific opportunity here for a country that is manageable to actually demonstrate to the world what's possible. In the US, I articulate a fuel strategy for the future that could completely eliminate the role of OPEC in the world. And the way I describe it, and you can imagine its implications here, if the United States of America produced not 6, but 10 million barrels a day, which it used to. During the 1970s and the 1980s, the US was pumping out 10 million barrels of oil a day, no problem. But it became more and more difficult to explain to the consuming public why we needed drilling rigs off the beaches of California or the beaches of Corpus Christi, Texas. And more people were resistant to doing that drilling. And at the same time, the costs associated with domestic production were rising while oil from the Middle East or from Nigeria or from other parts of the globe had such lower costs. And so the US went on an import binge where we exported risk in order to acquire lower cost imports. And that lasted for quite a long time, but it changed completely in the first decade of this century to where OPEC's in charge, the cartels running the price of oil completely. But the US still has all those resources. So let's go back to 10 million barrels a day. That's not a drill, baby, drill. That's simply repeating history. On top of that, with the natural gas supplies that the US now can produce, knows how to produce, with the hydraulic fracking, with the horizontal drilling, let's substitute natural gas as a transportation fuel for imported oil in 2 ways. One, let's really take a liking to the so-called Pickens plan. Boone Pickens, whom you may have heard of, has been advocating compressed natural gas, particularly for trucking, for quite a number of years. And he's been quite influential with quite a number of Americans and has created quite an outpouring of interest in this. But the Senate, the Democratic Senate last week, defeated the gas bill, which would have supported Boone Pickens' plan because it was simply not the right bill at the right time. And at any rate, why would we subsidize trucking companies to convert to natural gas engines and spend public money on infrastructure when the industry ought to be able to pay for that? And if we just got rid of the subsidies that we're giving to the industry, it would go a long way towards helping them understand that they need to support a natural gas transition for trucking. It doesn't quite work that way, as you well know. So we could take 2 million barrels a day equivalent of imported oil off the market by shifting to compressed natural gas for trucking, build out the infrastructure. We have so much natural gas, we could commit 3 million barrels a day equivalent to the production of liquid fuel for passenger cars, methanol in particular. All we need is open fuel engines for all the cars built or sold in the United States, and we could use a combination of ethanol, methanol, butanol to the equivalent of 3 million barrels a day of imports. We're now at 15 million barrels of supply domestically, all possible within the next 10 years. And we could take advantage of higher mileage vehicles and the use of hybrids, which is happening a bit, to get an equivalent of 2 million barrels a day. And then we could exercise the North American Free Trade Agreement to work with our neighbors to the north and neighbors to the south, both of which are well endowed with oil, for any and all imports needed to close the gap between supply and demand. That's an American plan to get 100% off OPEC. The way I say it on news programs is tell them to take a hike. Not very statesmanlike, I realize. But I have nothing but angry, negative passion towards OPEC, knowing what they do to control the price of oil in the world deliberately, and knowing how some of those proceeds are used. And so if the U.S. has no longer any interest in OPEC and its future, Straits of Hormuz, who cares? Take care of it, folks. It's your region. You take care of it. We're out of here. We don't need you. And likewise to autocrats like Hugo Chavez and other autocrats around the world who want to dictate terms with no rule of law and with no democratic legislative process to try to work through. If the U.S. is off OPEC and is working on fuels of the future, that's still not good enough, because we can do better. Having had the privilege of driving hydrogen fuel vehicles and battery-based fuel vehicles while president of Shell and since, once you experience the technology of electric drive, why would you ever want to go back to the internal combustion engine vehicle that uses all these liquid fuels? So you can set a path that is a transitional path that in North America we should be able to supply all North Americans with available, affordable energy from our existing natural resources while using our planning capability, our minds, our pragmatic outlooks to develop a fuels transition strategy to cleaner fuels, ultimately to electrification of the fleet, other than those applications which don't lend themselves to electrification, such as off-road, such as highly specialized applications, or air transport, or other things for which we don't have a technical, non-hydrocarbon-based strategy to consider. Now, why I think you have a chance to do this to lead the world, it's by watching how your government operates. And while I know that many people in Canada have some issues with the government of Canada, at the end of some period of time, things get done, unlike your southern neighbor. The U.S. will be, in the next 3 to 4 years, experiencing sustained high-priced gasoline, high-priced diesel, and ultimately gas line experiences because of shortages. And what I'm advocating for the United States, and would suggest you might want to consider it to avoid the kind of perhaps political predicament that could beset your country, is to consider a new governance model for energy. The governance model I write about is to follow the lead of what governs the monetary system in democracies. The central bank model is by design democratic, but can operate in isolation from the politics of the day because it's set up as an independent body. Independent of the pressures of the electoral cycle, independent of the pressures of the executive branch, the legislative branch, or the judicial branch. And while not perfect, because central banks have made choices that have not always been all that helpful, such as Greenspan's, followed by Bernanke's choice to allow loose money to continue for too long in the United States, feeding a housing bubble that ultimately burst, which we're still paying the price for, which also caused such other financial fallout from firms that were buying and selling so-called CDOs, which were mortgages all wrapped up in a big bundle of various and sundry quality of mortgage, which basically were junk being sold at real money prices. The Federal Reserve was not perfect in that example, nor was it perfect in the Depression era when it decided to restrict the money supply rather than increase the money supply. But apart from 2 periods of unfortunate human error, in my judgment, it was the independence of the Federal Reserve, along with the independence of the Bank of Canada, that enables these 2 economies, the U.S. to be the largest in the world, the U.S. dollar to be the benchmark currency of the world, because there is trust, there is a sense of well-being, because it is not politics of the day that drives the legislated authorities, the statutory authorities of the central bank. I think it's time, particularly for the U.S., given the problem it faces, of energy shortages and energy high costs, debilitating to its national security and debilitating to its economic security, It's time to consider the independent regulatory model for energy and the environment. And under that independent regulatory model, to do 4 things for the future of energy and the environment. 1, this is all wrapped up in a plan that looks out over 50 years, with a short-term period, a middle-term period, and a long-term period of that plan, 0 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, so that over a 50-year period, the people of the country can be satisfied, and the industry that supports the people's needs in that country can figure out what they can do to meet the 4 objectives. And the 4 objectives, number 1, make sure that we have adequate supplies of energy from all sources. So over the planned period, 0 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50, what percentage of the energy supply will come from hydrocarbons? What percentage from nuclear? What percentage from alternative energies such as wind and solar and biofuel? What percentage is from geothermal or hydrogen or hydropower? And over a planned period, when you're looking at the supply in terms of how much of what will fuel the economy, you have companies that can then invest according to the transition of the strategy. Secondly, second authority, make some tough technology decisions for the purpose of efficiency. That's the same thing as conservation. But make the technology decisions that will drive efficiency, not the least of which would be the elimination over time and the substitution over time of the internal combustion engine for preferred alternatives, whether batteries, hydrogen fuel cells, or other ideas yet to be considered. And in the course of that, if the United States did not use crude oil for internal combustion engine personal mobility, that's a 40% drop in demand for oil, just like that. Now, it won't happen just like that. But if you can see that coming over time, and you look at the possibilities, private investors can make the difference in building out the infrastructure necessary. Third, align the environmental requirements, the environmental standards, the environmental regulations with the supply side. Currently, the U.S. is anything but operating in cooperation on the supply side relative to the environment. It's warfare. And it plays out in the courts all the time. The environment versus the supply-siders. And it doesn't need to be that way because we're intelligent enough. We know the implications, the sustainability requirements of hydrocarbons and other forms of energy. So let's align the environmental laws, the environmental regulations, to move us through these cycles, the planned period. And fourth, make sure we have the infrastructure that will support moving the energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed. Infrastructure is a big deal in today's world, and if you don't have it, you don't have energy. And if you fight it, as happens in the US all the time, and I know it happens to be fought here as well, then who suffers? The citizens suffer. So to me, a planful way forward is to consider the governance of energy. Democracies are great systems except when they're not working very well. And the freedom and the independence that we get from a democracy has to be, I think, in a complex, sophisticated society, such as the modernity in which we live, has to be adapted and adjusted so that things that need to get done can get done. And I would submit that the fuel future of Canada, the fuel future of the United States, is so critical to the economic well-being of the citizens of these 2 countries that today's governance model, as well-intended as people are, but as conflicted as they play out in the electoral process as they are, may not work. And with the abundance of energy, I think high-priced energy is an imposition on the security and the economic well-being of citizens, and I think citizens of a democracy deserve better. Part of the freedom of a democracy that we can celebrate is the responsible use of the natural resources that we share in a democracy. And when I see the US politics playing out as energy policy, I have to tell you how angry it makes not just me, but 300 million of my best friends. Because nobody can afford high fuel prices. And at the same time, nobody can afford a dirty energy future. So the two can go hand in glove, in my judgment. And there is nothing holding us back but ourselves. So I wish you well. I hope tomorrow's conference will be very productive. I look forward to reading the report, which was published today, to learn from it. I'm a big advocate of transportation and mobility because to me that's one of the symptoms and one of the symbols and one of the realities of what a free people can do in a democratic environment. We have the freedom to choose, and that's the best of all freedoms. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening.